Hello and welcome. This is Lauri Ann Lumby with Authentic Freedom Academy, and this is week 5 of the Gospel according to Mary Magdalene. And our theme today is Mary the Encourager. And with that in mind, we will begin with Mary's own words as they were recorded in her Gospel. Jesus reminded them, "Impose no law other than that which I have witnessed. Do not add more laws to those given in the Torah, lest you become bound by them." Having said all this, the teacher departed. With his departure, the disciples were in great sorrow, shedding many tears and saying, "How are we to go among the unbelievers and announce the gospel of the kingdom of the Son of Man? They did not spare his life. Why should they spare ours?" Then Mary arose, embraced them all, and began to speak to her brothers. "Do not remain in sorrow and doubt. For his grace will guide you and comfort you. Instead, let us praise his greatness, for he has prepared us for this. He is calling upon us to become fully human." Thus, Mary turned their hearts toward the good, and they began to discuss the meaning of the teacher's words. Then Mary arose, embraced them all, and began to speak to her brothers. "Do not remain in sorrow and doubt, for his grace will guide you and comfort you. Instead, let us praise his greatness, for he has prepared us for this. He is calling upon us to become fully human." I chose to title this week's lesson as Mary the Encourager because, like every other true role that Mary Magdalene played, both as a disciple, companion, possibly wife of Jesus's, and in the days and weeks and months and years after his death and resurrection. This role of encourager has been forgotten. Not only forgotten, it's been flat out ignored. In canonical scripture, we see Mary being sent to tell the disciples that Jesus has risen. And the initial reaction, if we remember our canonical scripture, is, why would we listen to the ravings of this mad woman? This can't possibly be true. How is this possible? And in the canonical scripture, we get that first glimpse of Mary's rejection. But as it relates to all of us and the history of the Christian narrative, the forgetting of the feminine, the forgetting of the feminine principle, and of the unique gifts that arise out of the feminine that are not readily seen in the masculine as it's been understood for the last, I don't know, probably 5,000-ish years. So in Mary's gospel, first of all, we're so fortunate that this text has been rediscovered and studied and commentated on and brought into the popular audience for those that have eyes to see. Because we see the parts of Mary's story that are missing. We see the parts of our story that are missing. We see the important role of the feminine as, number one, deep listener, deep absorber, deep processor, deep listener. For it is only Mary that grasped the fullness of what Jesus came to teach. And we see this over and over in Mary's gospel, in the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, in the Piece of Sophia. We see Mary as being the recipient of the full and complete message of what Jesus called Malkuta and has been translated as the kingdom. Mary was able to receive this, number one, because of her own unique giftedness. Number two, because of the feminine principle of that deep listening and seeing, the receptivity that is characteristic of the feminine. She saw it, she heard it, she processed it, she applied it, she embodied it. Nowhere else, with the possible exception of John the Evangelist and perhaps Mother Mary, do we see this level of embodiment? Do we see this level of mastery? And it was because of that mastery that Mary was able to stand in front of a male-only audience and encourage them in their despair, comfort them in their grief, hold them in that frayed and vulnerable place of loss. They lost their teacher. They lost their companion. They lost their friend. They lost their beloved. For some, they lost their Messiah. And it was Mary who was able to stand in that discomfort, to stand in that excruciating pain. And number one, bear witness to it. Number two, not be destroyed by it. And number three, to be able to be that voice of comfort and encouragement that the other disciples needed at that place in their journey. And I think it's important to take note that Mary didn't need it. Now, as women, we all know that there's no way she didn't grieve. There's no way she didn't feel the pain. There's no way she didn't experience that evisceration of loss. But she was able to transcend her own pain, move through her own pain, to be there as a vessel of support for others who needed it. And doesn't that sound familiar? As women, we have all been in that place. We have all been in that place of excruciating pain and loss. And we have all been in that place where, while we were suffering, we were able to be a source of encouragement and support for others that were suffering. This is one of the gifts of the feminine, a gift that has been denied, ignored, suppressed, lost in much of Western culture. It's here and it's present, but it's not celebrated. It's not honored. It's not held as sacred. And sometimes we have to hear that thing that says, oh, that's women's work. Well, I'm kind of proud of the women's work that I have had an opportunity to partake in my life. I'm grateful for all the ways in which I have stood at that threshold of life and death and every place in between. I am grateful for the times in life that brings us to our knees, that maybe causes us to lay prostrate because we have nothing else to give. It is because of that pain and loss and difficulty that we have found our own inner courage, our own inner strength. We have been tested like gold that's tested in fire, and we have survived. We are all in the circle here together, carrying with us our own stories of suffering, of loss, and of the times that we have grown and found courage in the face of that loss, and how we have called to be comfort for another, even when we are hurting, or because of the pain we've gone through, we are able to be that encourager to another. Magdalene reminds us of the critical nature of that feminine principle and how it is present within all of us, and how we are each called to be a part of restoring the sacredness and the honor that that principle deserves. We are standing at the threshold of a world that is remaking itself. We are standing as witness to the death throes of a world that has been based in fear, power, and control, led by toxic masculinity, the unholy masculine. And we are called to come forward in our own unique way to be a voice crying out in the wilderness, saying, after this death, there is hope for new life. And the only way that that new life will succeed is if we find a way to restore the balance that was lost so many hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. Magdalene reemerging in the last 100 years is not a mistake. She is a herald of what we are to return to and what is yet to come. And so today we celebrate the Magdalene, but even more so, we celebrate ourselves. We celebrate the feminine principle that allows us to be deep listeners, intent observers, to feel and emote, to have empathy and compassion, and to be called forward in mercy as encouragement and support for a fearful and frightened and despairing world.